This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to update and upgrade our Lord Windgrace EDH deck. Thank you for joining us for this installment of the Up and Up series, and today we are going to add some cards to our Lord Windgrace Lands Matter EDH deck. We've got 5 cards going in, that means 5 cards are coming out, and we're going to start right away with our very first edition, and that's going to be the Root Path Purifier. Here we have an Elf Druid for 3 and a green mana. She is a 3/4, and lands we control and land cards in our library are basic. So how this is going to help us is because we are such a landfall-driven build that all of our cards that we want to search for are now going to turn into basic lands. That makes it so much easier for the Evolving Wilds and the Terramorphic Expanses and the Fabled Passages and the Prismatic Vistas to be played from our graveyard through any number of our recursive abilities like Crucible of Worlds and Ramunap Excavator and Ancient Green Warden. Those are all going to synergize with what Root Path Purifier does so well, which means we can put any land in our library onto our side of the battlefield by using any of those basic land fetching lands. That's a lot of lands, but you know this is a Lands Matter deck. Alright, so the Root Path Purifier is the first card going in. It is replacing OB. Yeah, it's time to bring out Ob Nixilis, the OG. This is the Fallen, the very first version of Ob. I personally really like this creature. The only problem here is that its landfall ability can only hit one opponent at a time. So whenever a land does come into play under our side of the battlefield, we have target player lose 3 life. Then we get to put 3+1/+1 counters onto Ob. But the problem with that is even though he gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and we do chip away at one of our opponent's life totals each time a land does come into play, without the evasion that we need to have these big creatures really make an impact, we really just have a French vanilla beater that can get chump blocked for days. And the fact that it only affects one opponent at a time makes replacing OB here with Root Path Purifier a much bigger impact because of what the Elf Druid over there provides to the 99 of this deck, where Ob is really just an entity unto himself. So with that switch, we are looking to make the overall build more enhanced and stronger, and I do think that the Root Path Purifier taking the spot of Ob Nixilis the Fallen accomplishes that feat very, very easily. Alright, next up we have card number 2 going into the 99, and that is going to be Awaken the Woods. Here we have a sorcery for X and 2 green mana. We create X 1/1 green Forest Dryad land creature tokens. Yes, they will be affected by Summoning Sickness, so we cannot tap them for mana once they come into play that turn. However, what we can do is reap oodles and oodles of landfall trigger abilities when we put all of these Forest Dryad land creature tokens into play. Each one of them will trigger all of our different landfall abilities, which, let's face it, if we get to untap during our next turn, that may just mean that the game is going to end. This is a very, very powerful card, and a copy had eluded us for many, many moons. Well, here it is, and it's going right into the best deck it was made for, and that is our Lands Matter Landfall Lord Windgrace EDH deck. With Awaken the Woods going in, it's going to replace Creeping Renaissance. Now here we have a sorcery for 3 and 2 green mana that allows us to choose a permanent type and then return all cards of the chosen type from our graveyard to our hand. And we also could flash this spell back from our library by paying 5 and 2 green mana, which means that we can cast it again and then exile this card upon resolution. The thought process here was that we only really ever used Creeping Renaissance to return lands from our graveyard to our hand. But with all of the aforementioned graveyard recursive effects, i.e. Crucible of Worlds, Ramunap Excavator, Ancient Green Warden, we never really had a big use for Creeping Renaissance because we were just playing those lands from our graveyard in order to get additional landfall abilities. By removing Creeping Renaissance, we put in something that gives us brand new, fresh into play lands while still allowing us to play land cards from our graveyard. In this scenario, by removing Creeping Renaissance, we give ourselves an even higher chance of putting more lands onto our side of the battlefield. If we were to cast Creeping Renaissance and return those land cards from our graveyards to our hand, yes, we can then play them from our hand, but putting them into play from our graveyard, that kind of, makes our graveyard abilities a little less powerful. So by replacing Creeping Renaissance with Awaken the Woods, we're still getting the ability to put lots of lands, and we put them into quotes, onto our side of the battlefield, except we have Forest Dryad land creature tokens as opposed to actual land cards from our graveyard. We'll see how that works, but I do think that swap will be most beneficial for this build. All right, next up we have card number 3 going in, and that is going to be a copy of Nissa Resurgent Animist. Here we have Nissa as an elf scout. She's legendary 3/3 for 2 and a green mana. She has a landfall trigger that whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we add 1 mana of any color. That is Lotus Cobra, and Lotus Cobra is 1 and a green mana, so Nissa's extra generic mana gives us quite a beneficial additional trigger. And that will be, if this is the second time that this ability has resolved this turn, we reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal an elf or elemental card. We put that card into our hand, and the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order. So, are there enough elves and elementals in the 99 of this build to make Nissa's second ability worth it? Well, we already showcased that the Root Path Purifier is an elf, so that would be applicable to Nissa's landfall ability. This stack of cards right here in front of our General Lord Windgrace are the other elves and elementals that are in the 99 of this build that would be revealed and put into our hand through Nissa. And those include Titania, Protector of Argoth, the Timeless Provisioner, Mina and Den, Wildborn, Omnath, Locus of Rage, Ancient Green Warden, which we've already referenced multiple times throughout this video so far, Radha, Heart of Keld, and the Avenger of Zendikar. So right here we have 7, and over there with the Root Path Purifier is 8. I think that's more than enough to get Nissa into the 99 of this build. This is no partner deck. We have enough elves and elementals to make Nissa's landfall ability, when it happens a second time, because it's going to happen many, many times in this build, Nissa is going to be extraordinarily valuable. Remember, that ability that gives us the 1 mana of any color will happen each time that we put a land onto our side of the battlefield. It doesn't necessarily mean that whenever we put the second or third or fourth land that we stop getting that mana ability. We still get the Lotus Cobra ability, and then we get the additional bonus of it being a second land by finding one of our elves or elementals from the top of our library. With Nissa going into play, it's going to replace Valakut Exploration. So here we had another landfall card being replaced by a landfall card. Valakut Exploration allowed us to exile the top card of our library, and then we may play it for as long as it remains exiled. But the only problem with that is we only have until the end of our turn to play those cards. Because at the beginning of our end step, if there are cards exiled with Valakut Exploration, we put them into our graveyard, and then this deals that much damage to each opponent. So in a way, we're using the top of our library to deal direct damage to all of our opponents through cards that we're not playing as they're exiled through this enchantment's landfall ability. With Nissa, we're being a little more proactive by getting cards into our hand, i.e. the elves and the elementals, generating additional mana to cast those spells, which will only make our side of the battlefield stronger versus the chaos of exiling the top cards, potentially playing them, potentially casting them, and then at the end of our turn having them deal direct damage to each of our opponents. We're going a little bit more battlefield here with Nissa, and in so doing, it's her replacing the Valakut Exploration should allow us to trigger all of our landfall abilities that much more frequently. We're going to see how that happens. Stay tuned for that swap. All right, the last two cards going in are just a couple of land cards that are going to take the place of lands that are already in the deck. So here we finally came across a copy of Ziatora's Proving Ground. It is our Jund quote-unquote Triome. It gives us one of the colors of mana we need. It comes into play tapped. It's very searchable with its basic land types being Swamp, Mountain, Forest. And if needed, we can always pay 3 to cycle that card away to draw a card. With that quote-unquote Triome going into play, it's going to replace Reliquary Tower. Now, in surveying and assessing the needs of this deck and the abilities and why we have Reliquary Tower in here, there was only really one card in this deck that really needed to potentially have Reliquary Tower in it, and that was Creeping Renaissance. We don't have ways to put oodles and oodles and oodles of cards into our hand, so replacing a card like Reliquary Tower that only taps for a colorless mana with one that gives us 1 mana of any of the colors we needed to cast the spells in this deck seems like a very, very easy transition. And the last land going into play, this land, kudos to longtime MTG Burgeoning subscriber Zephyr for recommending this card. It is Darigaza's Caldera. It's a layer, so when it comes into play, we sacrifice it unless we return a non-layer card we control to its owner's hand. So this is going to allow us to put this land into play, bounce one of our other lands back to our hand, and then play that bounce land again through any of the numerous extra land drop abilities we have in the 99 of this deck. So really what we're doing is we have a Rue land here that comes into play untapped, gives us any one of the 3 colors that we need, and then we can put a land that we already have in play into our hand, play it again, which only allows us to trigger our landfall abilities more and more. With that card going into the 99, the card coming out is Lake of the Dead. Now, when Lake of the Dead comes into play, we have to sacrifice a swamp or we have to sacrifice Lake of the Dead. And if we don't sacrifice a swamp, then this goes straight to the graveyard. Either way, we're putting a card into the graveyard as opposed to having it bounce to our hand through the Caldera over there. We can tap this land for a black mana, or we can tap and sacrifice a swamp to add 4 black mana to our mana pool. Either way, the Lake of the Dead was putting land cards into our graveyard for us to then play them from our graveyard through any of the aforementioned graveyard recursive effects. What we're doing here is we're eliminating the need to sacrifice our lands and instead putting in a Darigaza's Caldera, which then just bounces a land back to our hand, which allows us to simply just play it from our hand. The balance of mana here should work out, and we're going to keep an eye on that just to make sure. All right, there you have it. 5 new cards going in, 5 old cards coming out. Let me know your thoughts about these changes in the comments section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.